Hi, and welcome to Genre Chat. I'm Cherrilynn Bisbano. Today we have a mother, a homeschool teacher, writer, and singer. Her name is Laura Zimmerman, and she's going to be talking to us about sci-fi and fantasy. Welcome, Laura, and tell us a little bit about yourself, when you started writing, and other information. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I've kind of written my whole life. I'm one of the people that I've just found like manuscripts from, stories that I've written when I was in elementary school and then high school. And, I kind of pulled them out. They're kind of fun to see. It was a few years ago, my husband got tired of me sneaking away and spending a couple months writing stories or books and then doing nothing with them. So he came right out and said, I think that you need to go beyond my role as mother and homeschooler and do something more with it. And so he's the one who encouraged me to start with. So so it's only been, I believe, since 2013 around there that I really got serious about writing. But my husband and I have been married for 17 years. I've been in Pennsylvania in the Lancaster area until just over a year ago. And we felt like God led our family to make a big move, which we did. We went out to Phoenix, Arizona.
Wow, I have friends out there.
Do you? It's very hot.
Smith, that's not a common name. No, Smith. Yeah.
And soon after we got there, we recognized that God had bigger plans, and it was all part of maybe kind of walking through the desert. I kind of joke around.
Yeah, literally.
Since that time, he's now led us to the Charlotte area of North Carolina, which is where we are now. So,
wow, nice area.
So we're in Charlotte, and so I've been able to take my writing with me, which I love, and I can still school my girls, and I stay at home.
So you have two girls?
I have three. Oh. 15, 12, and 6. So, yeah.
So, wow.
So it's been the past couple of years, especially since I started writing, has been a journey, but I'm just excited that God's, put me on this journey. So we'll see where he takes me.
And so how did you choose sci-fi and fantasy? Was that your first choice?
Always. I mean, like I said, I used to write as a child too. And of course, one of my favorite things to do growing up was reading. And so when other kids, I mean, I'm talking even middle school, high school, when they would go to the mall, they kind of head to the clothing store. I always just went straight to the bookstore and would always go back to the fantasy or sci-fi section and grab a book and beg my mom if I could have another one. And that's what I've always read. And so that's what I like to write.
What was your favorite book as a child reading sci-fi fantasy at that time?
It's actually, I will admit, it's a little bit more towards the scary end, but I used to love Christopher Pike. He's an author who wrote all these like middle grade, high school, like horror novels and along the lines of Goosebumps, I loved being growing up. So yeah.
Now, tell us a little bit about writing. Is there a difference between sci-fi and fantasy? And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I find for myself, I tend to kind of combine the two because I like both worlds. But technically, there really is. I mean, sci-fi does need to have some sort of either like a technical type background, like technology, or I'm thinking of like Doctor Who, like time travel, something like that. It needs to have something based in science to technically be considered sci-fi, whereas fantasy is a little bit more open. And then there's different levels of fantasy. You've got the high fantasy, which would be like the Tolkien Lord of the Rings, or more modern day fantasy where, we've got the Twilight books that are about vampires and, and werewolves. So both of them kind of are a broad spectrum, but there's a lot of overlapping. And I know there's been so many, genres that have come about just in recent years, and a lot of them overlap. So I sort of lump them together because my joke is my head's in the clouds all the time. So whether it's truly a sci-fi story or fantasy story, I'm just always writing about something that's make believe.
Can you expound on some of those like subgenres? Is like steampunk one of them, or?
Yeah, and they all do kind of interlace. So I'm trying to think, like, for instance, one of the series that I would say fantasy. I guess you could also call it, I don't know, supernatural or paranormal. I mean, there's so many levels, but one of them, Cassandra Clare, is an author who wrote this young adult series called The Mortal Instruments. And they have angels and demons and vampires and werewolves and these Nephilim hunters who are part human and angel. And, so you've
like
got
from the Bible.
yeah, I know, but it's not a Christian based series, but like it is, a lot of it comes from the Bible. So it's interesting. But the first series was, very fantasy. And then she came out with a second series called the Infernal Devices, I think. I'm trying to remember. But that one was set back in, I guess, the 19th century, I think. I don't remember exactly the year, but it's actually steampunk. So it's the same characters. You've got these Nephilim hunters and the angels and the demons and all this. And it's the same idea, but then she interlaced it with the steampunk. So they've got like the mechanical horses and the dress, like all the things you'd think about steampunk is interlaced. So yeah, I think it is easy, especially with fantasy and sci-fi, to mix in other genres. And people sometimes ask me, well, how do you decide what you're going to label your genre as? And I think I'm a little bit more simple. I just kind of chalk it up to say fantasy. But right now, one of my novels that I'm writing is mermaid. And I think others may classify that, oh, that's more supernatural, or that's more paranormal, or something like that. But I think those genre names mean a little bit more for things like when you want to list the book on Amazon.
Right.
I've been, researching as far as that goes. You can list the book in multiple categories, and there's nothing wrong with changing your categories up because you do want to reach a wide audience.
Right.
So, but for my purposes, I usually just say I write fantasy and sci-fi. So,
where do you get your ideas?
Oh, all over. I'm definitely one of those dreamers. So I have the dream, I wake up, I write it down. But also conversations, because I have older daughters, teenagers, and they are interested in the same things that I am.
Oh, wonderful.
Talking about stuff, and one of them will say something and it'll spark an idea in my head. And situational, as I'm warning one of my daughters to be safe when they go out with their friends. In my mind, I start thinking things, and then I think, what would happen if, and then boom, suddenly a story's, in my head. If that happened, So I see it lots of different places.
Now, when you're crafting your story, what do you find more important, the character or the place?
Yeah.
Because with sci-fi and like with fantasy, the world, like I think of Avatar and the way the world was almost like one of the characters of the book.
Yeah, definitely.
I think you wrote an article for Almost an Author like that, didn't you?
I did.
Yes.
It does. It's true. The setting can actually, can absolutely be its own character. For myself, I actually am more of a character person as opposed to setting. I'm working on the setting part. I had another conversation with an author who mentioned that she had read something recently about how most writers tend to either hear the dialogue in their head or they see the setting. I'm definitely, I hear the dialogue in my head type person. And it's hard for me to see the setting. I can see the two people as they're looking at each other talking. I can see their body language. But I have to concentrate on seeing what's around them. So, and you're right, especially with fantasy and sci-fi, setting is very important. So that's actually something that I have been working on myself within my own craft. And I was pleased because one of my beta readers just came back just a couple months ago with one of my scripts that I had really gone through. And I mean, every single chapter when I was, revising it, I had said, setting, go back, and they wrote and said, wow, I could see every single setting. You did a good job with that. So I was like, yay.
Wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful. What is the greatest lesson you've learned while writing sci-fi fantasy?
Lesson, I think honestly that there are actually rules within sci-fi and fantasy. I know that it's easy to maybe just look at them and say, well, they're all just made up. They're all just make believe. You can make up anything you want, but there are rules that you as a writer should at least look into. You should research what you're going to write about. So if it's going to be a story about a werewolf, research that. Because not that you can't break them, but at least know that you're going to break the rule, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So for instance, I already mentioned the Twilight series that was so popular years ago. And I know one of the things that the author got kind of yelled at for was that she had really veered away from vampires, with their sparkly skin and everything. But ultimately, if you looked at actually what she had done, she did do her research and she had actually looked into other cultures. And I think that is maybe key with especially American authors, is we do tend to kind of have our own view of things, and
oh yeah,
the rest of the world will have these myths or these creatures that have a little bit of a different take, and we can put a spin on our story and not make it that traditional Dracula character, if that makes sense, for the vampire. So so there are rules, not that they can't be broken, but I think we should know when we're going to break them, if that makes sense. And just not, I mean, yeah.
The rules there, you have the one rule you just mentioned was do your research. Are there any other rules? Do you have a few other rules that you can give to us? Somebody who's just learning how to write or wants to get in, like what are the rules that you should not break? Or
yeah, I think especially even for something, for instance, medieval fantasy, I think of also movies that have been made. This is an older movie. I'm going to date myself, but I believe there was a Heath Ledger movie, The First Night. Which
I love that movie.
Yeah,
one of my favorite movies. Yeah.
It's pretty popular because...
So funny.
I'm sorry?
Was that the one that was really funny?
It was funny, and it was...
Yes, it was done very well, yes.
Yeah, they had the modern music and the modern clothing, set in medieval time. And so I think that's a good example because I am also working on a young adult medieval fantasy, and I had some more current language. I didn't necessarily try to keep my writing to some of the more formal language you'd read maybe in some medieval fantasies. And I was talking to another person about it, and she said, well, are you sure you want to do that? And we got into a discussion at a critique group, and it was brought up, which I agree with this, and I think this is a good rule of thumb, is if you're going to break something, make sure you maybe only break one rule. So for instance, in the medieval fantasy, if you're going to have the medieval world, keep the world the same. Okay, don't bring in, whatever, cell phones.
A car.
Yeah, a car, right? Unless it's a person that's time traveled. Okay.
Yes, there you go. See, there's another book.
But then you can change the language, or you can keep the language, but then maybe bring in something futuristic. So if you can keep one thread that is completely authentic, that will help ground your book and will not throw the readers. If you can understand that, it won't throw them for too much.
You don't want to
break
too many rules because then they won't understand.
Yeah.
Now, do you recommend any books on how to write in the genre of sci-fi and fantasy? Besides, I know reading in those genres will help you write better. So many best-selling writers tell us that. Jerry B. Jenkins, Cecil Murphy, everybody says, read. But are there any books on writing that specific genre?
Good question. I did look up a few because you had asked me that question, and I haven't personally read them.
That's all right.
But I did write them down because I actually added them to my to read list on Goodreads.
Great.
One of them actually, it looks like it's a few authors that had written it together, but it's got Orson Scott Card is involved, who wrote Ender's Game. It's called Writing Fantasy and Science Fiction. And that, when I was looking into it, that looks like a very good book. Another one was called Fantasy Writing Prompts, which would be good just to practice the craft. Overall, if I'm going to recommend a book on craft, it usually is Stephen King's On Writing, which I know is the one that everyone recommends. I particularly appreciated his book, though, because he, I guess technically he's horror. He writes more horror, but he falls within the speculative range. And so I felt like what he had to say applied to me.
Right.
That
I enjoyed the book too. There's a few F-bombs in there, but I enjoyed it because it was Stephen King. I used to read his stuff all the time when I was younger. I don't now because it's just too scary for me. But the way he describes things are just so realistic and down to earth and matter of fact, like you're sitting there having a cup of coffee with him and he's telling you how to be a good writer. That's what I loved about it.
Yeah, and I even appreciated it to the point that it wasn't just on writing. I felt like he had some good ideas just for living. And I recommended it to some other friends. I said, when you get to the writing part, you don't have to read on, but he's got a good story. So
yeah, he does.
Yeah. So, and another book I would bring up, again, not necessarily on sci-fi fantasy craft, but I'm really kind of hooked on Alan Arnold's The Story of With right now. I don't know if you read that.
No, I'm gonna write that down.
Alan Arnold's Story of With. Yeah. He actually has a Facebook group too that you can join, but it's very encouraging, and it's about writing with God, how God created us to be creative beings. And ultimately, he is where all of our inspiration comes from and our ideas, and God wants to be with us every step of the way. And so that is not necessarily specifically on craft, but more just on nourishing the soul as I come to the writing table. I like to either flip through the book and look at quotes or think back on it because it is very encouraging. And so that would be the number one book I recommend to any Christian author.
Oh, wonderful. And before we have a few more minutes, but I want you to do you have any parting words of wisdom for people who want to write in this genre?
Yes. I would say people, a lot of times, especially being involved in social media, because as a writer, we were always told it's very important to be involved in social media. However, there's also studies showing that the more involved in social media you are, the more depressed you can become, because it's kind of hard. It's a hard balance.
It's a happy medium. Yeah,
it is. It's a really hard balance to get that level where you're connected, but it's not bringing you down. And I think the thing that everyone says is, well, don't give up. It doesn't matter how many years you've been writing, don't give up. And I absolutely appreciate that. I mean, we all need to hear that. And there's been blog posts and memes and all sorts of things I've read and I've reposted because I'm like, yes, I needed to hear this today. Don't give up. But beyond that, I would actually encourage everyone to take a step further and say to encourage each other as writers.
Yes.
Because it doesn't matter how much we try to keep it in our head, don't give up. We're all going to have bad days, bad weeks, bad months. And and we all struggle. And sometimes, especially looking at the social media, it doesn't look like anyone else is struggling, and we can feel so alone. And so, within that encouragement, I think in other areas of entertainment, maybe there's a little bit more threat. People think, oh, well, I don't want that person to get ahead of me. But the one thing I've seen within the writing world, which I really appreciate, is it really does seem like a lot of authors support each other. And so I would say, keep doing that and really keep that encouragement. I've even seen hashtag encourage a writer on Twitter. And I would say, jump in with 2 feet and do that, because I think we all need to hear that. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Now, how can people get a hold of you, Laura?
My website is my full author name, which is Laura L. Zimmerman. And also on Facebook, my page is Laura L. Zimmerman. As far as Twitter, it's Laura L. Zim, and I'm also on Instagram, Laura L. Zim author. So it's always going to have Laura L. Zim somewhere in there.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I just want to thank you. This time went by way too fast. We've been talking for almost 25 minutes. It's wonderful. You can also find Laura has a column at almostanauthor.com, which is part of Serious Writer. She has some wonderful, wonderful tools and information there. So that's Almost an Author. She's under the genre section, fantasy, sci-fi. Thank you, Laura, so much for taking time to be with us. And everybody join us next week for another edition of Genre Chat. Take care.